Bring back our stolen money, the people demanded. And that's what is happening now, believe it or not. We have a lot of properties and money being seized all over this nation. You hear about it in the media and on social media every day. And that is the result of a lot of hard work, a lot of legislation, and things are actually happening right now. To discuss all this, I have with me one of our regular guests who hasn't been on our show for quite some time. I'm talking about Sankhitha Gunaratne, attorney at law, who is, of course, the Deputy Director and Head of Governance and Anti-Corruption at Verite Research. Good evening and welcome to Face, Sankhitha.
Good evening, Naresh. Thank you for having me.
Right. So, all of a sudden, without much fanfare, we see these events happening, that the Bribery Commission and the CID are moving in and seizing assets and basically freezing these assets. And these are assets worth tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of rupees. We see apartments, penthouses, lands, properties of all types, and of course bank accounts as well, and vehicles. So how did we get to this point, which is what the people wanted? After all, this is our money, which was taken from us by various nefarious individuals.
Right. So, for years, Sri Lanka has been calling for a Proceeds of Crime Act or asset recovery. As you've just mentioned, on the streets during the Aragale, people were saying that if we could bring our assets back, the stolen assets back from other countries or wherever it's hidden, that we'd be able to solve Sri Lanka's economic woes. Now, there is a semblance of truth to that, in that the amount of assets stolen, we know, if you're a Sri Lankan, you know to a great extent there's been a large-scale abuse of public resources throughout the years that has happened. So it is safe to presume that it is out of the country or hidden elsewhere in the country. So bringing it back was always possible, Niresh. It was always possible because countries across the world, without laws in place also, under their standard criminal laws, can seize and confiscate assets. But what Sri Lanka needed was a fit-for-purpose law to actually be able to keep up with the rate that the criminals were going at. Because across the world, criminality is also getting quote-unquote better. Criminals are getting better at doing what they do. So law enforcement is in a constant chase trying to follow the money. So in 2017, after the Global Forum on Asset Recovery that focused on Sri Lanka as well, there was an effort by the Presidential Task Force on Stolen Asset Recovery at the time to draft a framework.
This was the Yahapalana regime.
During the Yahapalana regime, there was an attempt made. There was a framework made for a Proceeds of Crime Act for Sri Lanka. It went to the stage of getting cabinet approval, but then it fell by the wayside for a while. Then under the Ranil Wickremesinghe government, it came back into play with the attention of the IMF also on it. And then it was finally passed in Parliament in April this year. So to your question of why are we seeing all of these movements, not all of it is under the Proceeds of Crime Act, but we saw on the 20th, the Proceeds of Crime Investigations Division being set up under the Sri Lanka Police. So there are two authorities that are set up under the proceeds that get powers under the Proceeds of Crime Act mainly. One is the Proceeds of Crime Investigation Division under the Sri Lanka Police. The second is SIABOC, the Bribery Commission. So they both work in tandem on the Proceeds of Crime Act, on giving effect to the Proceeds of Crime Act. And we saw on the 20th itself, the media reporting that assets worth 4.5 billion rupees had already been seized by this division. So It is
That's a lot of money,
that
isn't
is a lot of money. So it is under this Proceeds of Crime Act that a system now has been put in place for law enforcement to coordinate better, to have more powers, and to be able to be more agile, subject to procedural safeguards.
Right. And let's talk about the Proceeds of Crime Investigation Division. Again, we see the Sri Lanka police also being revamped, restructured to make it more agile, more able to meet these contemporary challenges. What does this new division do for this particular type of law enforcement?
Yeah, so the Proceeds of Crime Investigation Division and the SIABOC in tandem are given powers to look into illicit wealth. So this act is interesting and important because it doesn't focus on the crime itself. It focuses on the proceeds of crime. So the purpose of the law is to deprive criminals of the benefits that they derive from their crime and thereby deter crime. If you can't enjoy the fruits of your labor, quote unquote, if you worked very hard to be a really active criminal and you've made a lot of money out of it, you take the money and assets and your children's education and all of it out of your control, then what's the point in your lifestyle of criminality, right? Thereby, then you deter that kind of criminality. So that's the entire logic of this. So the PCID, the Proceeds of Crime Investigation Division, and SIABOC are empowered to act upon this. So for example, if upon a complaint received by either a member of the public or one of the many authorities that have reporting obligations under this law, you receive a complaint, and upon receiving that, you find a cause that there's reasonable suspicion that a particular asset is the proceeds of crime, then at that point, the PCID or SIABOC, depending on the crime, if it's a corruption or bribery related offense, it will be SIABOC or the Bribery Commission that would act. If it's any other crime, it will be the police that acts, the PCID. So they would then be able to send to the relevant person something called a notice calling for explanation. And within 3 working days, or you can ask for an extension, the person that is linked to the asset would have to come and give an explanation to the PCID or to SIABOC, the provenance of that wealth, the asset. How do you have that asset? Right? You have to be able to provide an explanation. And if the explanation is not satisfactory, the PCID or the SIABOC has the authority to actually seize the asset. They can seize the asset and then go for judicial authorization and go for judicial freezing of the asset. Now, before court, the relevant individual would have to show on a balance of probability, like a 50% chance, they need to show that the asset was their legitimate wealth. If they are unable to show that, the state, under judicial authorization, can confiscate the asset back to the state. So in doing so, an additional point is that there is a presumption that any wealth, any asset that a person can't explain is the proceeds of crime, is derived out of crime. So it is up to the accused in that moment or before court through due process to establish that no, this is how I obtain these assets through my legitimate sources of wealth. But one really interesting thing about this law is that you can go after the person, but you can also go after the assets alone. Now, we've seen many instances in Sri Lanka where there's a drug kingpin who's said to have assets across the country, but they've died, right?
Okay.
In that kind of instance, if the state is able to establish on a balance of probabilities, again 50% or more, just above 50%, that the asset was the proceeds of crime, so it's linked to a crime, then you can confiscate it, unless the other person comes and says, unless the true owner comes and says that it is legitimate, you can then confiscate it to the state. So it's a much shorter route than having to actually convict a person and go after their assets. That route is also available under the Proceeds of Crime Act. So you have both routes. One is what we call, the first one I talked about, non-conviction based asset forfeiture. The second is conviction based asset forfeiture. So this is an innovation that is used across the world to go after assets, because as I said, the focus of this law is on the assets. It's not on the person themselves. The person also well and good if you can prosecute and convict them, but you can still go after the assets. Even if the person is acquitted, because you can't reach that high standard of proof, if you can show on a balance of probability that the assets themselves are the proceeds of crime, you can still proceed against the assets.
Now, several points come to my mind. The first one is how lovely it is that investigators, police officers will no longer be overawed by these massive displays of wealth. Because, whenever policemen see a huge property, they think, oh, that's somebody, I better not mess with this. Or somebody drives in to the police station in a Mercedes-Benz or a BMW or one of those big SUVs, and you basically used to see policemen snapping to attention, but no longer. Now the signs of wealth are actually a minus point, isn't it? Because the policeman would be thinking, well, where did he get the money for that? And we've got the laws to look into that.
That's a really interesting way of thinking about it, but it also requires a cultural shift, as you and I very well know. Just because the law has changed doesn't mean that people will stop snapping to attention and treating people with wealth with overt respect, at least. But if that level of knowledge about the law and about the requirements and even the reporting requirements on the law are properly socialized, both with law enforcement and with the public service and with the general public, as you say, that's where we are headed. What we want, a culture where overt displays of wealth, especially illegal wealth, would count as a minus rather than a plus. Something that's worth mentioning, Miresh, is that this law sets out an entire spate of, by my count, about 44 different individuals and authorities, individuals heading authorities that have a reporting obligation if they have a sense that there are proceeds of illicit wealth, that they're privy to that kind of knowledge. So, for example, the Director General of Customs, the Director of the Financial Intelligence Unit, predictably, but even certain local government authorities, there's a long list of individuals who have now a statutory obligation to report under threat of fines and penalties, that they have to report if they know of proceeds of crime anywhere. So it's not a small obligation, and they even have to put in place systems within their own institutions to ensure that they get the information properly and there's a way to relay it to the authorities.
Right. So that's part of the culture change that you were speaking about, and my wishful thinking that this will happen. Well, I'm sure it will happen at some point, but it will take some time, of course. Now, you mentioned the two methodologies to actually seize proceeds of crime. One being having to convict a person, which of course takes a long time. After all, it is a legal system.
In Sri Lanka, research by the sectoral committee in Parliament in 2018 showed that a general criminal case goes up to 10.2 years on average from the point of indictment to the order, the judgment. Right. And if you add appeals, it goes on, becomes 17 years. 17
years, right. And of course, the criminals know that in those 17 years, there would be several changes of government. And that, of course, in the past has had some bearing on, political influence.
And actually, if I may interrupt, when it comes to proceeds of crime, the unique problem that we have is that it's not a question of the law's delays. The moment a criminal has a sense that you're going after their assets, the assets dissipate. They go out of the country, they go off to some offshore jurisdiction, it pings several touch points across the world map and then disappears into some black hole, making it all the more complicated for law enforcement to have to negotiate legal systems of all of these countries, law enforcement courts of all of these countries, the kind of political capital it takes to have mutual legal assistance between these countries to navigate their own secrecy laws, banking laws, things like that. So it makes it all the more difficult for law enforcement when the assets dissipate in that period of time. That's why this law has really provided for the powers for law enforcement to be able to take immediate action to seize and freeze, of course, subject to judicial authorization within a short period of time and safeguards.
Right. And there are, of course, global networks which specialize in making such assets disappear very quickly. It's the old money laundering game, isn't it? So, and the wealthy and powerful, they have those contacts, especially the ones with the nefarious methods, and all they do is make a few calls, and the matter is done, and your money, which is sitting in Sri Lanka, would suddenly be wherever in somewhere in the Caribbean or Seychelles or somewhere. It's just vanished off there. So, as you said, this the ability, the authority for Seabok to go in without any warning and seize is actually spectacular, isn't it?
If they have reasonable cause that giving a warning will lead to some kind of, it'll stall or stultify the purpose of the investigation, they can do that. But generally they have to give notice, but they can actually go to court, get an ex parte order on their own without notifying the other party, and then go and take action. So there are safeguards built in, but certainly these powers have been provided for. It's a state-of-the-art law, I would say. Yeah.
Right. Now, let's look at where these criminal masterminds park their wealth. Now, there's the obvious properties. You build you buy a huge land, you build a huge house, but then that's there for everyone to see, and you can't get rid of that very quickly either. So that's fairly easy to seize. But of course you get the penthouses, luxury apartments, and so on. But you also get luxury vehicles which suddenly can disappear, right? Just a couple of weeks ago, I think a bulletproof Mercedes-Benz was found in abandoned in a garage. So that costs a lot of money. So obviously somebody had it and needed to get rid of it quickly. But also there is wealth in cash. Could be in banks, could be somewhere else. And this can move very quickly, can't it?
Yeah, so that abandoned vehicle is a prime example of something that you can proceed under non-conviction based asset forfeiture, because if no one is going to claim ownership, the state can confiscate it subject to judicial proceedings. So about cash as well, cash can move quickly. There are financial advisors across the world that we know, like we saw in the Pandora Papers, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, the FinCEN files, you name it, in all of that facilitating the flight of money, asset flight or illicit financial flows is a global business. And interestingly, some of the Western countries that we see as the paragons of democracy or those that are pushing for transparency often end up also on the top of the financial secrecy index run by the Tax Justice Network, if you look at it. If you look at countries like Switzerland, with their extreme banking secrecy historically, secretive banking systems, they end up being at the receiving end of a lot of these financial flows. There was some research a couple of years that showed that when Africa receives foreign funding for development activities, there's a corresponding and higher outflow of funds around the same time. Right? So these illicit financial flows remain a huge problem across the world. That's why, just like the Proceeds of Crime Act, our money laundering provisions, our financial transactions reporting provisions, counter-terrorist financing provisions in the laws, all of those need to act. But also, it brings to question this idea of cooperation, right? So we have the origin countries like Sri Lanka, and then you have the destination countries like even New York and London that are prime spaces for people to go and park their money, because these are prestigious locations to be seen in, to own property in. So it's a bit of that glitz and glamour that the kleptocrats of the world are also seeking. So that cooperation becomes really important and has been made possible by this law. So what it does is it creates an official mechanism by which the SIABOC and the police can coordinate with law enforcement officials. It empowers them to coordinate with law enforcement officials abroad. So, I mean, everyone, when we talked about asset recovery, everyone is really talking about international asset recovery, right? No one was talking about the purportedly smaller amounts of money that was hidden in country. So when you talk about asset recovery, there are four main stages. One is the pre-investigative phase. That is where you have informal conversations. Your law enforcement here would have informal conversations, say, with the FBI, and says, could you just look at this person and see, like, is there anything suspicious? Are they driving this car? So it'll be a very informal, or do they live at this property? Does the property actually belong to this person? And then you go into the actual investigative phase. Once you have like reasonable cause to think that there needs to be a more formal engagement, you would go into this phase of requesting mutual legal assistance. So that would be a literal document that is sent through the governmental authorities to the destination jurisdiction, a mutual legal assistance request. So once they agree to that, then you coordinate with that law enforcement and carry out a joint investigation. And that is now possible under this law. And you can even do joint investigations between SIABOC and the PCID as well, so that we don't have that problem like before, where you're working in silos, everyone's working on the same case, but no one's talking to each other. So this sets up a different mechanism where you can coordinate and you have to coordinate. And then you come to say you find enough evidence to actually confiscate the assets. You find that this asset belongs to this person and it's illegally obtained because they were part of a corrupt tender deal and they siphoned off money out of the government, right? So then you go to a judicial phase where in that country where the assets have been stationed or parked, you would go into a judicial phase where you'd either our officials will go and file a case there, or we'd get an order here that is enforced there. And that's how then we come to the asset return phase, where the assets would go through that government, be sent back to this country. That's how we saw Theodorin Obiang's assets being sent back to Equatorial Guinea. That's how we saw the Abacha loot going back to Nigeria, I believe in 2 or 3 phases. Uzbekistan is seeing some asset return happening. So that's the kind of process that happens. This Proceeds of Crime Act has made sure that we have a system by which all of this can happen, and it's a well thought out system. So for example, it also sets up something called a Proceeds of Crime Management Authority. Now we all know outside the FCID or the FCID, we saw for years this Mustang or some fancy car parked, wrapped up in a tarp, chains and ropes, I believe it was. I can't remember. I have a mental image of this. We saw this happen. Was that good for the value of the asset? Is the asset appreciating in value over time? It is not. So this law sets up a Proceeds of Crime Management Authority that has to ensure that the asset is managed optimally in a way that can be recovered back to the state in due course if it is confiscated, without losing its value both to the owner and to the state in case you manage to prove that it is the proceeds of crime.
Right. So there's a lot more to talk about, but first we'll take a short commercial break. I am in conversation with Sankhitha Gunaratne, who is, of course, head of governance and anti-corruption at Verite Research. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Hey, ඒකින් බොරේප් කරන්න.
අර පිසිතුවේ අප්පා
එපා පිළිගන්න උඹ. පින්සිත් වෙන වැඩත් කරගෙන ආවේ. නේද මමානේ. ඉතින් ගොබිලෝ. ඕක පුරුදු වෙන්න යන ගමනක්ද? ඒ වඩ සමාවෙන්න මට. මේ මගේ නංගියකෝ.
ආලේ. හෙට රාත්‍රී 8ට සිරස ටෙලිතිරයෙන්.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I'm with Sankhitha Gunaratne, attorney at law and deputy director and head of governance and anti-corruption at Verite Research, and we are discussing bringing back the stolen money. And now, Sankhitha, something occurred to me when you were talking about that luxury car parked outside this FCID. There are perishable forms of wealth. You take, for example, things like works of art and other perishable forms which need to be taken care of or which need to be disposed of quickly, as in the case of that car. Because if the case is going to run for 17 years, the car is worth nothing at the end of it, right?
Yeah.
So how does that process work?
So remember the two routes I talked about, the conviction-based asset forfeiture and the non-conviction-based asset forfeiture. In the case of conviction-based asset forfeiture, this problem has really been solved by the law by actually saying that you can go for what is called value-based confiscation. So if it was you that was being prosecuted and you were held guilty of money laundering and there was your car that we wanted to seize, right? But the car is worth no value anymore. It doesn't correspond to its original value that you laundered. Then we can go for a different asset of yours instead.
Oh, right. Okay.
So that is what value-based confiscation is in the case of conviction-based asset forfeiture.
Interesting, indeed. So these new laws have really encompassed all of it, isn't it? And it's all based on global best practices.
Yes. So the UN Convention Against Corruption has an entire chapter on asset recovery, chapter 5, and Sri Lanka has been reviewed for compliance with that. So actually in this process, we've had, it was since 2017 that we've been working on this law as Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka has benefited from a lot of global expertise. I think our viewers will know of the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative of the World Bank. That was all the rage. The STAR program, that was all the rage. STAR has assisted the Basel Institute, the International Center for Asset Recovery. The Basel Institute has helped. There have been Japanese experts, US lawyers, all of them feeding into this. So I'm not saying the law is perfect. We had pushed for certain amendments as well. Some were incorporated, some were not. But by and large, the law, I think, requires support. It passes muster. And it's fit for purpose at this point of time, subject to it being enforced and implemented in good faith and subject to the procedural safeguards that the law itself provides for. Yeah.
Right, but among the safeguards is the ability for non-state actors to get involved. So it's no longer waiting for the Aegis Department or the President or whoever to act, because in past regimes that was the problem. They wouldn't act, or they would come up with umpteen excuses, and then the matter would just fade from view. But now individuals and organizations can get involved.
Yeah. So with this law, there are several avenues. One is a remedy, a civil remedy for victims of crime. If there is a victim of any unlawful activity, they can actually go to the district court and say that this loss has been caused to me because of a crime under Sri Lanka's laws. It's not limited to any crime, any unlawful activity. Say someone stole from you. You can go and say, due to the actions of this other person, I have been caused loss, pecuniary loss, sentimental loss, that any kind of loss can be covered. And you need to show on a balance of probability that this crime has occurred, and then that this loss has occurred due to the crime. And then the court can ask for that loss to be paid back to you by the perpetrator. So there is that action. So that is by the victim themselves. If there's a group of victims, there can be a representative victim that goes and appears for everyone's behalf, on everyone's behalf. But the third thing is the most important one, and what we think is most important, because that's something Verite Research pushed for and got incorporated into the law. And this is a really interesting innovation and inclusion into the law. That is for a non-politically aligned civil society organization who is not a victim to be a representative and file a representative action in the district court and say, look, loss has been caused to the state or to the general public because of an illegal activity, and go that route and get the loss recovered, and it can go back to the state. It doesn't go back to the organization that filed the action. It goes back to the state or that victim group. No, so that is, sorry, just to connect it to your point, sorry Nilesh, just to connect it to your point, our historical issue has been when it is those that are in power that are also the perpetrators. Because of that conflict of interest, we find that our authorities somehow self-censor or are forced into not taking action. So in that kind of situation, the citizens always felt like they were left out of the bargain, right? They know that this crime is happening, they know that they're victims of it, but they're left without any recourse. So now in situations like that, where say institutions are captured or censored or held back or interfered with, tampered with, in that kind of instance, the citizens can, through representative organizations, take matters into their own hands through the legal process and go to court and claim that loss back.
Well, that's fabulous, because speaking as a journalist, many times, very often, when we make revelations about criminal activities, bribery, corruption, bad deals, all kinds of scams, sugar scam, garlic scam, you name a commodity, there's been a scam. And then nothing happens. And then we are left wondering, well, we took a great risk to our own lives and the lives of our informants, our sources, and then nothing happened. It's futile. And then the public wouldn't come forward again either. They'd be less likely to, because they'd say, what's the point? But now this is different.
Absolutely. This is just for that kind of instance of inaction that we're so frustrated with, and we're so familiar with also. That is why we pushed for this amendment, and the drafting committee, to its credit, actually incorporated it, because it's not a small thing to incorporate. It's a big change to incorporate into a law. And that's why I think the law benefited from consultation, limited consultation.
But it's also not just politicians and civil servants stealing money or taking bribes. This is also about, let's say, drugs. You're in the narcotics business and you're making hundreds of millions. That wealth can be seized very easily, because if you suddenly go from driving a Maruti and suddenly you're driving a Porsche, well,
Yeah.
you have to explain that.
Yeah. So, what is really interesting about the entire drug problem and in terms of criminal networks is usually you have to establish the nexus or a connection between the drug mule and the drug lord, or whatever gender neutral term we want to call it.
Which often doesn't happen.
Which often doesn't
due to fear.
happen because the drug kingpins, etc., are hidden behind layers and layers of protection. But what we do know is that they benefit from the asset. They live a lavish lifestyle. As I mentioned, their children's own yachts and live abroad and have properties abroad, etc. So we no longer have to establish that nexus between the people. You only need to show that the proceeds that they're enjoying, that they're benefiting from, cannot be lawfully explained. If it cannot be lawfully explained, and they can't on a balance of probability show before court that it belongs to them, then it can be confiscated. So it takes away that protection that the kingpins and the masterminds of any kind of crime has, as long as they're benefiting from it. Right? That's why I talked about the logic of the act at the start. It is entirely the approach of the law is to deprive criminals of the proceeds of their illegal activity and therefore the benefits of their illegal activity, so that it's no longer to their advantage to stay in the business.
Right, and this all goes hand in hand with certain actions happening with the Inland Revenue Department and tax collection, and the fact that now more and more citizens are coming within the tax net and they need to declare their revenue for the year, but also their assets. So you've got to declare your properties, your vehicles, your jewelry, your fixed deposits, all of that. And then all of a sudden, if you next year you own something, okay, a penthouse worth 500 million rupees, you have to explain that. Otherwise, there is a paper trail which can be referred back to.
That's the thing. So that law enforcement coordination I talked about. So the Commissioner General of Inland Revenue is one of the people who have a duty to report to the PCID or to the CIABOC if there's a suspicion of any kind of unlawful or the commission of some kind of unlawful activity. So usually we have to depend on them to do it of their own volition. Now there's a mandatory obligation under the Proceeds of Crime Act. So as you say, it does connect to the Indian revenue, whatever you declare in your tax declarations. But also now the systems in Sri Lanka, without limiting ourselves to the Proceeds of Crime Act, the systems in Sri Lanka are getting a lot more interconnected. So for example, we know the CIABOC, the Bribery Commission, right now is building a central electronic system for asset declarations, and there are estimated to be about 350,000 declarants who will be making their assets, filing their assets and liabilities declarations on the system. So what that means is if anyone is found with assets that are not disclosed there, the omission itself is a crime under the Anti-Corruption Act, but also CIABOC can go after the asset under the Proceeds of Crime Act. So it gets a lot harder to come back to court and say, oh, but I actually owned it. I forgot to declare it. I'm sorry. Because the presumption will be anything that you can't explain is the proceeds of crime.
Right. And we are almost out of time. So my final question is, for decades, Sri Lanka had this reputation of being lawless, where money laundering especially was concerned. And it was very easy for even foreign criminals to send their money in here and turn black money into white, basically. And there were, in fact, some periods where our governments actually welcomed such wealth, despite the hue and cry that bankers and so on raised. But no longer. Now we will take our rightful place. among the civilized nations?
Ideally. So by March next year, the Financial Action Task Force of the G20 through the Asia Pacific Group will be doing a review of Sri Lanka's systems and readiness to face the threat of money laundering and countering terrorist financing. So not only because of these laws, but because of international pressure also, we now have an urgency to get our house in order, because not just so that we are not just having things on paper, but we are also acting upon it. So at this point of time, I think it's really important that we use this opportunity with the best possible faith to ensure that law enforcement coordinates and makes the best out of the laws that are there in place, and also show a non-partisan, balanced approach to applying the law, because without also being drunk on power. Right, because these are quite substantive powers that are being given. So ensuring that due process is followed, that reports are made public about the assets held, assets seized, what action is being taken, that I think is an obligation that falls on CBOC and the PCID as well, in terms of their investigations, in terms of how they select cases, how they select their targets, all of that, to make sure that they are reported, that they are documented, that due process is really followed. But also one, I guess, final addition is that on the part of CBOC and the PCID, they also now have the ability to get access to the expertise that they need. It doesn't have to be them alone. They can talk to international asset tracing companies, they can talk to forensic auditors, whoever they need in doing this as well, because that is also enabled by the law. But making sure that they're in this, like put their head down and they're in this for the long run, so that we're not seeming at any point, because in Sri Lanka everything gets politicized, right? Everything is seen as a political game. So maintaining that perhaps they're doing, but maintaining the image that they're also, acting outside of any kind of political interference is also important. So making sure that the conversation with the public is happening within reasonable limits.
Awareness creation.
Yeah, awareness creation. And trust building is a continuous conversation that needs to happen. And it can happen through transparency and accountability and public reporting. And that's something I would always urge the police and CBOC to do in the rollout of these powers and laws as well.
Sankhitha Gunaratne, thank you very much. I've been speaking with Sankhitha Gunaratne, attorney at law, Deputy Director and Head of Governance and Anti-Corruption at Verite Research. Thank you for joining me this evening, and thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away, because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.